Welcome to Coffee with the Bishop. My name is Daniel. I'm the Bishop of the Diocese of Upper South Carolina, and I'm joined today by my usual sidekick,
Jessica St. Clair Smith. Good morning.
And we have a guest with us today. Charles is our unofficial, for now, historian for the diocese. Do you want to introduce yourself, sir?
Yes, my name is Charles Egleston. I was born in Columbia, South Carolina, where we are right now, and I have a ministry to try to explore African Americans in the Episcopal Church in South Carolina.
And we are sharing shots of Jolt Espresso from our local Inda Coffee roasters here in town. Pulled on the Brevier in my office. So I think maybe it's Breville. I think people call it Breville, but it's spelled like it's French. I feel like I should say Brevier to show that I have some French culture. But here in Columbia, you have the same problem when you drive down Gervais and have to decide if it's Gervais or Gervais. So it's
And then, of course, there's UG Street.
Oh,
that's right.
I'm embarrassed to tell you guys, it was a very long time. I mean, truly, I'd worked here a year, and I heard somebody say UG, and I thought, well, which road is that? And she said, oh, did you think it was Huger?
Or Huget.
Or Huget. I thought it was Huget. And I thought, oh, okay, cool. I'm glad I've never said that out loud to anyone.
The French Huguenot words remain, names remain, but not necessarily the pronunciation here in Columbia.
Mm-hmm.
The Huguenots, when they came in very early on, intermarried with the Episcopalians. So if you're looking for an Episcopalian ancestry, you'll find many Huguenots.
Yes, and with it, you get all those French names.
Yes, with the French names.
In the graveyard. Well, we have just been recently exploring the history of the African American churches in our diocese, and frankly, if you're going to talk about the history of the African American churches, you have to talk about the Diocese of South Carolina pre our separation in 1922, which you're going to hear a lot about as we go forward. But I just wanted to start with why this is important. You know, we come to these moments in our calendar when we talk about Black history, and it can feel like a secular part of our cultural life. But here in South Carolina, in the diocese, and I would argue in the church as a whole, part of being able to live into the fullness of who the body of Christ is called to be is to recognize that we come from all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of ethnicities, all sorts of countries. And as I've stated before, that's part of what makes the body of Christ unique, is that we are not tribal, we're not national, we're not racial. We are called out by a creator who created the whole world and created all people. And so as we are going to represent the creator revealed in his son, Jesus Christ, we are called to be a people who represent people from around the world and people from within our own communities who are diverse and different, and are also bound in a common humanity because of our relationship in Christ. And so when we come to tell our story, it's important to recognize that the perspectives on our story do shift with some of those social locations, but it's also important to recognize that this is our story. And so as we talk about the history of the Black congregations in our diocese, or indeed in the whole state, what we're really talking about is our story as a people of God. And it's a story that is incomplete when we begin to turn away from those segments of our story that are difficult or that are uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And we have sort of a cultural moment where people are wanting to sort of sideline the history, and particularly the difficult history that we have with the race in our country. And as you're going to hear, the Episcopal Church has had great moments of forward thinking, and great moments at times where our forward thinking was forward thinking in the midst of some pretty awful racist history. Mm. And we've had moments where we're really able to see the image of God in each other in ways that feel miraculous, especially when you give the full context of those particular moments of revelation. And we have a long history here in the diocese the South Carolina was one of the 13 original colonies, was also one of the originating dioceses of the Episcopal Church. And so our history goes back to them, but we're not probably going to cover all of that today. But we did want to talk about, I should note, Charles comes to us from a long period of being the historian and archivist for the Diocese of Rochester.
Long Island.
Long Island. Mm-hmm. And he's had a fabulous relationship with that office and with the bishops there. We're glad to have him back home in Columbia. And as he came home, one of the first things he did was reached out to the office and said, "Hey, I'm ready." And so tell us where our first Black congregations were in the state.
All right, our first Black congregations in South Carolina, the first one would have been the Wateree Chapel, which was erected in 1820 in the fort where the Wateree River meets the Congaree River to form the Santee River. William Clarkson was a dedicated Christian. He'd come over from England, so he had a cotton plantation there named Middleburg. And because he was a person deeply interested in the faith, he thought that he needed to build a chapel for his enslaved persons. And that chapel was erected in 1820, and it was for all of its existence until it burned accidentally in 1866. It was a Black majority African American Episcopal church for much of its existence. So that particular church, that particular building, it was called the Wateree Chapel, was the earliest plantation chapel dedicated towards the ministry of the Episcopal Church in South Carolina. That's the first.
Now, I recall from our conversation, though, that you said it carefully, it was Black majority because there were always white folks in attendance.
Right. In this particular case, the white church in that area, which was called Zion Church, and was last in Eastover, was only erected beginning in 1844. So it also had services for African Americans, but the main services were at this Wateree Chapel and its successors. Beginning in 1879, 1880, Thomas Boston Clarkson, a local planter whose grandfather had built the Wateree Chapel, rebuilt the chapel, and it lasted until pretty much the end of the 19th century when the land was sold and the chapel was abandoned. And that was William Clarkson, the man that erected the Wateree Chapel, died in 1825 in New York. He's buried in the churchyard of the Cathedral of St. Luke and St. Paul. Within the cathedral is a plaque to his memory erected by his family roughly around 1827. And one of the words on the plaque, phrases on the plaque, is that he erected the church, meaning the Episcopal Church, on his estate in the Richland District, which is what Richland County was called at that time. Now, you have to remember that it's an African-American chapel, and what they're doing is they're saying this is important, that he gave the church to these people, whether they're white or Black. It doesn't say to give it to the white people and let their slaves use it. He establishes the church in the forks between the two rivers. And yes, that's true. True story.
And I think one of the things that we recognize, we look through this history, is that you'll see the establishment and really generous establishment at times of slave chapels, and then later of African American communities by plantation owners and slavers. And then as we move past the 1840s into the 1850s, and the pressure on the slavery network and the slavery economy, The inhumanity was being called out by the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, by many things, abolitionist movement, particularly in the North, but also here in the South. As that becomes louder, the necessity of sort of a white supremacist ideology gets louder, and we see the breakdown of some of those relationships under that pressure. The white community becomes more doggedly white isolationist or white supremacist. I mean, I don't even quite know how to put it, except that we see a lot of the generous establishments in the early 1800s begin to disappear as that pressure increases as we head toward the Civil War. It's just important, I think, to recognize that is going on within the body of Christ, that it isn't something that we can isolate ourselves from, that history.
It is actually quite complicated. The first evidence that I have of a bishop of South Carolina visiting a plantation chapel is only in 1841. By 1855 or thereabouts, there were 45 Episcopalian dedicated African-American Episcopal chapels on plantations in South Carolina.
Gosh.
You read about African Americans being taught to memorize the Ten Commandments and the Lord's Prayer, and then taking the piece of paper and saying, well, I know how to read now because I know what this thing says. Mm-hmm. You can see that that's happening in South Carolina from their own perspective. They see these plantation chapels as a way that their elderly people and their children can be served by the church. At the same time, especially in Charleston, African Americans have been attending St. Michael's and St. Philip's from the early years of the 19th century, and St. Paul's, to give the cathedral its original name, from 1810. African Americans are attending there, but they attend as separate within the congregation, and they only go to communion after the white people have finished. We have to keep remembering that they're second-class citizens within the actual congregation.
Well, and you pointed out in our conversation the other day that then one of the repercussions of that is that when we have the Emancipation Proclamation, the end of the Civil War, during Reconstruction, a lot of our African-American members within the Episcopal Church then left to AME churches and other places where they would be first class. They would be established members. And so we had 45 plantation chapels. We had a lot of churches where we have dual registration of not just baptisms, but confirmations and marriages. And then after, particularly during Reconstruction, but afterwards, we see this sharp decline in African American Episcopalians as they move to some other congregations where they would be recognized fully.
Mm-hmm. They go from a number of about 3,200 African American communicants, that is, people that were confirmed, to 300. But we must also think about the fact, and this is a glory of the Episcopal Church, there were people who stayed Episcopalian, worship using the Book of Common Prayer because the church did not send them clergy. And did that for 15, 20, 30 years until the African Americans could come together, ordain African American clergy, who then recognized that these people worshiping in the Episcopal tradition outside of the church needed to be brought into the church again.
Now, that brings us to an important story. Who were our first African American clergy in the diocese?
Thaddeus Saltus is the first African American ordained in South Carolina on February 6th, 1881. I believe that's the date. I don't have my notes with me. The first African American ordained in the Episcopal Church who was born in South Carolina, was a man named Edward Jones. And Edward Jones graduated from Amherst College in Western Massachusetts in 1822, while also in 1822 was the Denmark-Vesey discovery of the Denmark-Vesey plot, and the South Carolina legislature, in its desire to fight any sort of abolition motion, made it against the law for any African American from South Carolina to return South Carolina. So he was never able to return home. He bounced around. The Bishop of Connecticut set up a seminary to train black priests to go to Africa to convert the Africans. Edward Jones was in on that first class and went to Africa. And he died in England around 1865. The second was a man named Thomas Pinckney, and Thomas Pinckney was from Charleston. He was ordained for Liberia in 1852. He went to Liberia and got sick and went to England. Couldn't come back to South Carolina. Went to England, and they sent him to Canada to work with the fugitive slaves that went up there in 1850 with the Fugitive Slave Act.
Now, you have his name in the registers.
Yes, he did something with St. Thaddeus in Aiken, because he's in the sacramental register for St. Thaddeus in Aiken. His name is right below the name of a woman named Elizabeth Jackson. That would be Thaddeus Saltus's mother before she married Philip Saltus. So very interesting. And right below those two names is the name of a woman named Betsy. Her history is very interesting because she belonged to a woman named Wessner. And Wessner was a man who built St. Thaddeus Aiken. He was a builder, but he was also at one time master of the workhouse in Charleston. When he died, his estate was indebted to Edward Lawrence. So Edward Lawrence bought Betty from Wessner's wife, and whatever happened to Betty, we don't know. But Wessner's wife owned Betty at the time.
That connection goes back to the roots of South Carolina, the Mepkin property being owned by Lawrence, who's one of the sort of revolutionary figures, and then Mepkin still being the site of the Mepkin Abbey.
Right.
Which was later beautified by other owners and is worthy of a visit. It's one of the places where I do my retreats twice a year. But that then connection between Mepkin and St. Thaddeus, and I think one of the interesting sort of narratives that we keep running into is this, how the church provided a humanizing part of life in an inhumane system.
Yes, we find that, and it's clear that African Americans, one of their reasons for participating with the Episcopal Church and becoming involved is to get a record of their existence. One of the things that started me on this process was to make a long story short, I got a sacramental register when I was in the Diocese of Long Island that had marriages of African Americans between 1800 and 1807. And the marriage record would have 5 names on it. It would have John, the slave of Mr. Smith, and Mary, the slave of Mr. Jones, were married by me on this day, Reverend John Ireland, written permission of the masters. Now, why did those persons get married in the church? It was a record. It was illegal until 1813 for African Americans to be married in New York. So this was a way that they could record their marriages, because in 1799, New York passed the Partial Abolition Act. Later on, New York passed a full abolition act in 1827, but this was 1799. and the African Americans could not marry legally. So they said, fine, we'll go to the church and ask the priest to marry us. And if we have to get written permission, we'll get written permission. What you see as the marriage is gone, there's over 20 marriages, less and less permissions, written permissions to marry the people, because the priest, obviously, a priest who had been in South Carolina before he went to Brooklyn, the priest begins to recognize that these people are getting married. It's between God and the people and me as an officiant. It's not so much about who owned one or the other party of who is getting married. You can see him changing in how he records the marriage. Quite interesting. He came to South Carolina after he lost his position at this church in Brooklyn, St. Anne's, Brooklyn. He came back to South Carolina, where his best friend was in Charleston, a man named Edward Kennedy. And obviously, he was looking to try to get another church position. But John Henry Hobart, the famous Bishop of New York, took special effort to make sure that the church in South Carolina knew that he had this man deposed from ministry. He made sure that they knew in South Carolina that he was not a person you could put in charge of a church, because he was outside the Episcopal Church. Went back to Brooklyn, became the second U.S. Navy chaplain, and attended the same church that he'd been the rector of, and died and was buried out of the same church that he'd been the rector of.
Do we know why he was deposed?
He was deposed. It was said, if you really want to know, it was said that he had not recorded a special Christmas offertory, and he had in fact recorded it, but he accidentally, or for whatever reason, he recorded it in the sacramental register, and because it was in the sacramental register, he refused to give up possession of the sacramental register to people in the church who were arguing with him for whatever reason. We can extrapolate and say it's probably because he freed their slaves, because we have one marriage that he crosses out. He says, could not get permission from the master. And we know who that is. That was the man who financed the church in the first place, the largest slaveholder in Brooklyn, who had, I think, 16 slaves. Normally in New York at that time, slavery was 2 or 3 people on a plantation, on a piece of property. It had to do with agriculture, providing food for the city of New York. But this particular person had a rope walk and needed, a rope walk is where you make ropes.
Right.
You need labor for that. So I think at the time he had like 16 enslaved persons in an urban environment. There's no Brooklyn Bridge at this point, you have to understand. This is a separate city from New York City.
Right.
So that particular person refused permission for an enslaved person that owned by him to get married. So it comes to the point where this particular priest is challenged by one of the members of the vestry,
An important member,
not the wealthy man, but another man challenges him in a public house or something, and he curses the man and threatens to beat him up because he's threatened him, and the word is reported back to John Henry Hobart, who makes sure that the Bishop of New York at the time, Hobart's later the bishop, makes sure that the Bishop of New York deposes Ireland for threatening one of the members of his church. That's why he's deposed.
Gosh.
You see, but whether it's a true story or not, and this is all documented. This sort of what got me into this whole thing, that and the fact that, and I will bring this, it's important, Richard Beeman Martin, the Right Reverend Richard Beeman Martin, is an important South Carolinian. He was ordained a suffragan bishop in the Episcopal Diocese of Long Island, was born in Peak, was baptized in Waverly Mills, became a bishop in the Diocese of Long Island, was confirmed in the Diocese of South Carolina, became a bishop in the Diocese of South Carolina, was ordained to the priesthood at St. Augustine's in Wedgefield, South Carolina, which is not in Wedgefield, but that's how it is in church records. Wedgefield moved, apparently.
Wedgefield moved and the church did not.
The church did not. The church was in a town called, if anybody wants to look this up, Bloom Hill. It was named after the plantation the land was given to, on the plantation was given to the church when it formed in 1886.
So I'm going to just take a moment to say that Charles getting involved in this has meant that he's applied the full range of mental acuity, but also collections as a researcher and archivist in his own home. Jessica and I went over to see his home collection. He has copies of documents from South Carolina Museum and other places that just documenting this history, and including all of the journals from the Diocese of Upper South Carolina, but also South Carolina from the digitized files at this library, and then the bishop's logs, which are of personal interest to me.
I bet. Yeah.
Fun details about going to ordinations and going to Christ Church Greenville in the late 1800s, and then being over at St. Paul's Pendleton, and then over at St. Paul's Pendleton for a vestry meeting, and then over to Anderson for a vestry meeting and a confirmation and evening prayer. And it makes my schedule make more sense that we've been doing this for 200 years.
Well, and he did it all on a horse.
Well, and there were railroads. You could get almost anywhere on a railroad.
Oh, right.
Oh, that's true.
They cut off, once the railroads start to go, then we lost something that would have been wonderful, but it's gone now.
Oh my gosh.
But the great thing about being able to see these documents is the way that it humanizes these stories. And if there's anything that I would just sort of want listeners to come away with, sometimes history becomes abstract, and we lose the thread, and we have such a public discourse about the discomforts we have with our history, and to go back and to actually be able to see the handwriting, to see those registers, to see even copies of the books where you see the faithfulness and the struggle to do the right thing, and also the places where we failed as a church, as an institution, and individuals. But then to see these places where people really were able to be humanized. The marriages piece is such a great key to understanding what it means to faithfully register human beings so that they're recognized as human beings. I mean, what a beautiful statement in the midst of a horrible system.
Exactly. And it happens in South Carolina too, but it really begins here in 1819. I would recommend listeners to go on the University of South Carolina website and see if you can find the Journal of Convention for 1819, because in that journal, a man named Christopher Edwards Gadsden, priest, the rector at that point of St. Philip's, later bishop, but asks that what John Jacob Schutte, Reverend John Jacob Schutte, has to say about African Americans at St. John's, Berkeley, needs to be heard by the entire diocese. What John Jacob Schutte does starting around 1817 is he starts to minister to groups of African Americans. There had been African Americans who were baptized, married, and so on and so forth in St. Philip's and St. Michael's journals earlier, but they tended to be 1 or 2 or 3 people at a time, not generally groups. So by group ministry, you begin to, what Schutte does is he begins to establish congregations, people that can say, listen, this priest has really got wonderful news for us about how we can, nurture ourselves and nurture our families and protect ourselves going forward. You need to listen to what he has to say. So that comes forth beginning in 1819, and that's where William Clarkson probably heard about the need for ministering to groups of African Americans.
How did our first Black congregations come to the upstate? We have our St. Thomas in Eastover, St. Luke's here in Columbia, which is a Reconstruction era, and then we have Epiphany in Spartanburg. And you've done a history of Epiphany.
Epiphany starts in 1893. The priest at Church of the Advent in Spartanburg is the major person to get Epiphany started. He worked with a man named Samuel Poignier, who had been a chaplain for the Union, who moved to Spartanburg after the war. The first chapel, it comes out of, actually relates to the St. Luke's. It was a priest named Benjamin Babbitt. Trinity here in Columbia had very few African-American communicants, largely, I believe, because they were so close to the center of government. But Benjamin Babbitt comes to South Carolina out of Rhode Island in 1871, and he's indefatigable in setting up missions and work with African Americans. He sets up missions in Fairfield County, in Newberry County, in Lexington County, and brings in the descendants of the Wateree Chapel in the 1880s, 70s, and 80s. So that's like a core group. So Newberry is where is as far north as that ministry effort goes, but towards the end of the 19th century, there's a priest who comes out of North Carolina named Joyner, and he begins a church called St. Paul's in Rock Hill. He would be the first, I think, the first effort towards the upstate of South Carolina, because the Episcopal Church is mostly strong in the areas below Columbia towards the coast up until the late 19th century.
That's part of what created the split it really starts around 1900, but by 1922, when we officially split, part of the reasoning for that, the push came because the diocese would not send priests up to the heathens up above the fall line.
Exactly. Well, there's also this: when William H.W. Howe becomes bishop, they talk about setting up a place for the bishop to stay in Columbia, because it's so difficult geographically to move from something like Beaufort to something like Spartanburg. I mean, when you think the distance, and there's no highways at that point that are easy to get to, and how far can the bishop go. So it was largely geographic. It comes basically the first church in South Carolina in the upstate is really Christ Church Greenville, because of missionary efforts that had gone on in that area. So Christ Church is like a core, and Anderson and Union and so on and so forth come out of Christ Church. You can see that happen. Glen Springs, for example. You have to remember that malaria is endemic in the 19th century. So after about 1790, people began to leave the plantations in May and would not return until September once things got cold again, because it was dangerous to be around standing
Mosquitoes.
water.
Yeah.
Okay, it's
Absolutely.
interesting that it's only in 1790 and 1800 when that happens. What's happening, I believe, is that Africans are being brought in who have been exposed to malaria, and they're helping spread the malaria around to the population. The mosquito doesn't care what he bites.
Right. Right. No respecter of
No
of
respecter
class.
of persons.
They don't discriminate. Yeah.
Well, you have a newsletter that was produced almost 100 years. The Spirit of the Nations, is that what?
Spirit of the Missions was
Spirit of the
published from
Missions.
roughly 1835 to 1935, and I've gone through it from 1835 to 1911 for all references to South Carolina, because that's what the mission would be involved with at that point.
And there's a quote. There's an article written by Bishop Gary about, and it's I want to say it's 1866. I mean,
It's about 1885. I think it's fairly near the beginning of his ministry. Well, it's 1911 because you pulled it out of the front of the box, and I
you're
know how
right.
the box is organized. So
That's right. You're right. And the striking line, which given the theme of this year for our diocese of looking at the Imago Dei, the image of God that we're created to be, the striking line in the article that 1911. So think about when that is. He writes in the article about the need for outreach to the African American community in South Carolina and the need for this missionary work. And this is, 50 years. And he writes, God help me that I have to say this, but you can even see the image of God in the African American community, and that he has to defend the missions work. It was a heartbreaking, but it was also this moment of real clarity about this history matters, because we do slip into a kind of dehumanization when we come to these cycles of sin. And it's such an easy thing for human beings to do. And when you look back at our history, it's something that we didn't just have as a sort of external force to the church. The church supported these processes. And so you have these people who within the church itself, priests and bishops and lay people who really took important stands against it. But you also have people who just faithfully, as you said, picked up the Book of Common Prayer and kept going in the face of that dehumanization. And so part of our hope is that through this archive work, through the research that Charles is doing, and our own ability to tell our story, is to lift up our own stories from within. And so as we go back over these names, and you're going to see a couple of portraits in the photographs on the webpage connected to this, and as we go back through that history, for us as a diocese to lift up these stories, to lift up these saints of the church who are not often remembered, and to remember that we are, if we are going to be the whole image of God, if we're going to be a more perfect reflection of God's glory in humanity, then we have to have more color and more diversity and more life than we do currently. And so the essential nature of this work, this history, is so important. And as we go through Black History Month, I just encourage you to look back at your congregation's story, to look back at those pictures and think of who's not represented, but also to just remember those people who have gone before us, who have made this journey to where we are, and to not pick up the blind spots of our own age, but to continue to look for the glory of God in the faces of the human beings that we meet, and to call all of us into a greater sense of the unity we have in Christ and the more diverse body of Christ that reflects back God's glory in the world. So thank you, Charles, for your work. Thank you for how important this is.
say one thing here. I'd like to encourage people to contact me if they would like to see the archive. It's promised to the South Carolina Historical Society, with some portions of it going to the African American Episcopal History Collection at the Virginia Theological Seminary.
Cool.
Also, I would like to second what the bishop said and use the phrase prophetic imagination, which Walter Brueggemann coined, and say it's not about knowing that there's a problem. It's imagining a solution that it fits with what God intends, not with what the society tells us has to be.
Yes. And we have some, I'm just stunned. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times just in being together where you would hear this story of this work being done. And it's hard for us to articulate the pressure of the slavery system, not just on the decisions made about someone's will, but made on the wills of human beings to think differently in a time of oppression, to imagine a church where African Americans were kneeling at the rail with white plantation owners and were called together in common prayer, called together in common worship. We don't have that same pressure, but we should be able to dream big about a church that's more full and more reflective of the glory of God. And that prophetic imagination can lead us to futures we could not imagine on our own.
Yeah.
And like the people coming out of Egypt to imagine a world where they were not Pharaoh's children, but God's. Is such a part. I mean, that those songs that we sing oftentimes as we remember those spirituals, they were hope and imagination at a time when you could not see a future, and yet there they were lifting up worship that imagined something greater than the moment they were in. So may we dream. Thank you for joining us for Coffee with the Bishop. Thank you, Charles, for your amazing work here in our diocese. And we will have contact information for him.
That's right.
I would join in seconding his comments. Please reach out. Let this knowledge become part of how you think, so that your dreams may be more rich in the glories of God. Thank you, Jessica, for getting us out there on the air.
Yes, sir.
And thank you to Enda Coffee for a lovely shot of espresso.
Yeah.
May God bless you all, and I'll see you along the way.
Coffee with the Bishop is recorded at the George Alexander Diocesan House in Columbia, South Carolina. It is produced by the Episcopal Diocese of Upper South Carolina and edited by Jessica St. Clair Smith. Do you want to hear discussion about a particular topic? Have a question for our bishop? Do you and your study group have a disagreement about a matter of theology that needs settling? Send it to us at communications@edusc.org. Coffee with the Bishop is our twice-per-month podcast. We hope you'll also join us in 2026 as we read What the Bishop Reads, a new initiative to read good books and think deep thoughts together. Notes along the way, our bishop's personal written meditation to you is available by email each week. More information on both is available at our website, www.edusc.org.